Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Beyond the Book, a show where we break down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they're played. Joining me today is my co-host Troy, and behind the scenes is Jay, and of course, I am Max. Today's topic will be coming back to a B-side episode, which was an old format that we had, and re-exploring that concept, which is scope and scale, but hopefully in a more organized and fresh way.
That's right. This is the first episode of our new format, where we're going to be doing more topical discussions of concepts and theories and how they relate to tabletop gaming, both role-playing games, war games, and Secret Answer C tabletop board games.
Yeah, exactly. So we hope that these are going to be a bit more of a casual discussion, but we do want to keep a structure behind it. So let us know if we're keeping you engaged, and of course, like and subscribe if you want more of this. But without further ado, let's get into the topic at hand, which is scope and scale, which exists in mostly war games, but as we'll get into, it technically is a consideration for any kind of game. It's just whether that concern is a matter of the designer's attention or the player's attention, depending on how in-depth the rules and how flexible the game you're playing is. So let's define our terms. Troy, maybe you can get us started on that.
The first term we'll define will be scope. Scope relates to the player's point of view or lens of focus, and it includes the player's range of influence and limits in the game world. So the scope would be perhaps what you're in charge of or in command of, in other words. The scale is how we rate and track the actions, the distances, and the levels of abstraction in a game.
So another way to maybe put it is that the scale of the game is the mechanical operational components of what's being used, and the scope is how the rules govern those mechanics. So what level are we operating at? And some of those are implicit to each other, but there are definitely games that try to do more than one level of scope in a single game.
That's right.
There's even examples where different scales are sometimes used. Let's further define some of these things. So typically when people think about scale, they're usually going to think of a term, at least common among wargamers, which is ground scale. It's typically the size of the unit you're playing. So this is where you get terms like 15 millimeter, 28 millimeter, 30, or on the very low end, like 6. Or if you're playing a hex encounter game, it's the value on the tile. In that case, it's quite abstract, but there's a consideration to how zoomed out we are physically.
Ground scale will also specifically relate to, for example, what is an inch or what is a foot on a gaming table. So, for example, if you have a 1 inch equals 12 yards, that will tell you about the distances involved, the range of weapons, and the speeds of movement.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot comes from the size of the model. Now, there's some interesting caveats to that. But before we get into that, I think another major thing to note about what the scale of a game is, and we kind of determined that the broader level of a scale goes from what is often referred to as man-to-man, which includes skirmish games, but in a lot of ways includes role-playing games as well, where you're at an individual level, and that's just a historical term for that. And then the very far other end of the spectrum is typically what's called grand strategy. And this is where you get the sort of national leaders level of operating the game. So this is like games like Risk, if you want the common example.
Axis and Allies would also apply for sure.
Yep. There's an old game that's kind of like a middle ground between Risk and Axis and Allies called Attack.
Oh, yeah.
And that is also a grand strategy game. There's also grand strategy games that are hex encounter games. Not too many of them, but you don't have to do a territory-based game necessarily to be at that level.
That's right.
It's more about, do I see the whole world?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good indication you're playing grand strategy. Though it doesn't have to be the whole world. For instance, the game Diplomacy, I would argue is a kind of grand strategy game.
I would too.
It's a very cooperative, but it typically only governs around Europe and Northern Africa.
And these actually kind of relate to the table space, the ground scale being countries or, hundreds of kilometers, where when you get to a man-to-man game, your table space zooms down and can be as small as like 300 meters across, and you're dealing with a farmhouse or an industrial manufacturing facility or, the main road of a Wild West town.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the practical concern in your ground scale is how much table do you want to deal with, or how big a table do you even have? When we were doing Charles Grant's Battle, this is just a callback to an older episode, we were a little bit astounded by the size of the table that he had, which I can't remember, was like 9 feet at one dimension and maybe 7 at the other.
Yeah, something like that.
In my own experience, can only really be achieved by pushing several tables together. My own rule of thumb is that if I can't reach the middle of the table from one side, it's too big. That's my personal. Obviously, you can use prods to move units, but miniature units don't always behave well under those circumstances, from what I've seen.
I agree.
Yeah. I pushed it out like well beyond my reach. Oh, it tipped over. No, that guy's not dead. He's still in. So that's one consideration, and I guess a kind of limitation or dimension of the game is, like in our last episode, Space Weirdos, there's a very clear denotation in the rules that we're playing on a 2-foot or 3-foot table. So that's a very small space. And likely that's anybody's normal kitchen table, with maybe if it were rectangular, you've got a little space on the side for keeping units off table. But there's other ways around this. And one of those ways, if you don't have the small units and you only have the large units, is a concept called bathtubbing. Troy, maybe you can kind of break that down a bit more.
So bathtubbing is a classic tradition in wargaming where you will represent something at a greater scale by using the actions of a smaller scale. So for example, if you wanted to represent a battalion attack in the Second World War, where you had 4 companies attacking a point, two companies up, 2 in reserve that come in. If you wanted to perform that, you could, instead of actually representing that in full with the hundreds of soldiers that would involve, you could do maybe a battalion represented as a platoon or a company, fight that level of conflict, and just say that it encompasses the greater overall fight. Like, this is the spearhead that specifically counted in that clash. Like, this is where the action really happened. Or you can be even more abstract than that and not even focus on what else happened and just say this was the whole thing. And that's a tradition that's been seen in a lot of naval games, hence the title bathtubbing, but it applies to a lot of historical games. And fantasy games don't tend to explicitly state they're doing it, but when you compare the number of models on the table in, say, a game like Warhammer the Old World or Oathmark, and then you compare that to the fiction that's being written, they're implying hundreds or thousands of troops, and you're fielding tens or hundreds of models. So there's a distinction or a difference there in the scope and the scale between what it's kind of almost advertising it's going to be and then what the actual models are going to end up looking like on the table.
Yeah, I mean, some games explicitly make mention to this level of representation. A good example of this is Too Fat Lardy's Chain of Command, where it says that you can play with pretty well any range of models suggested to be between 15 and 28. But the way that the creator plays it, and he claims it's due to his eyesight, which is fair, is to play each of those teams as represented by a single large 28 millimeter model. So we know that one unit represents actually a bunch of guys that all move as one group. So that's a different way of kind of giving an example for how that would actually be played.
And you can play that game with 28 mil figures at a 1-to-1 scale ratio where one soldier is one man, or you can do that in 15 mil.
Yep.
And you're not changing your base measurements in the game, So, for example, you wouldn't go ahead and play in centimeters or reduce the number of inches in a maximum range, for example, between 15 and 28 mil. You just play as is. In 28 mil, it's more of a cinematic appearance. It's more heroic looking in a certain capacity as units are closer together. But in 15 mil, you do get that empty battlefield look where things are separated by a greater distance and little guys can hide and still influence things at a further pace from themselves. So there's reasons to do both, but I think setting on your level of scale and your level of scope, even within the one game you are playing, is a player decision.
Yeah, I get the feeling that the reason that's not done in a lot of fantasy games or science fiction games is because, well, for one reason, the companies that typically make those are trying to sell models. So collectively representing a lot of units with a single unit is an excuse to not necessarily field more stuff, which is why whenever they want to show off the ideal table, it sometimes has like hundreds of units on it.
It's like a parking lot sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, units are just sort of representative tokens of something being there. That's one of the reasons, like, to use the chain of command example, and if you're interested in that game, I definitely suggest looking it up. But we play with, typically, Troy and I and our friends play with 15 mil, and we move them in sort of clouds. And there's some interesting details that come up, like, for instance, that cloud has, in some ways, a formation.
It should, yeah. When you're playing well, you'll be thinking about your formations, for sure.
Yeah, and there's definitely like another level of tactics that come in. So the idea that those two model scales are necessarily interchangeable without issue, I haven't found exactly true. Like, for instance, for a lot of the measurements on things, we have actually cut those minimums in half. So, for instance, I believe it's written as 4 inches to see through forest, but we cut that down to 2 because the scale of the models made more sense.
Yeah, that's a common house rule for sure.
As long as your system is accommodating to that, yeah, you can change the scale of your units without too much issue. As long as you know, either after playing or looking at how that might work, that you're able to judge accurately that, yeah, it doesn't make sense that they can see that far through, a wooded grove. But if I took that half, then it'd probably be fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's something that's kind of in the abstractions. Like how literal or abstract you want your game to be. Like you're talking about the scale of models and the level of abstraction. We just talked about it in a prior episode, but I just did some Warhammer 40,000 10th edition. I quite enjoyed it. But what I found was it's quite abstract in terms of your units and their behaviors, but you're playing with the highest level of detail and large scale of models. So the game itself has an interesting tension between the fact that these are really great detailed models. They're very large and they're very bespoke for the setting and the units you're playing with. But it would make almost more sense to be doing this in 15 mil because the rules imply a certain zoom out that then the models themselves sort of don't play along with.
Yeah, so that's like the opposite problem of what I was describing in the case of this game, which is using obviously prettier and easier to paint and more show-offy models. That's another reason why models are bigger, is because small models tend to all look kind of the same. And if they're bigger, then they look more distinctive, which is really good for a skirmish game where each character might be different. Even if they are using the same model, you could paint them like, oh yeah, that guy with the shoulder pad, he's that guy's twin brother, but he's totally different loadout.
Well, that's part of the command level that kind of is part of your scope, right?
Yeah.
Because we've alluded to this, but skirmish is kind of your introductory level of scope in terms of the number of participants or people you would potentially control.
To go to the idea of scope by comparison, that is most represented in what is sometimes called command level.
Yes.
Which is essentially, I think a good way to understand this is, in this battle, who is the player representing? To use chain of command, for example, it's a platoon-based combat game for the most part. You could obviously play larger scales if you want, but you are effectively headquarters in this case at that particular command level. But in a game that's let's say, a Western game like Boot Hill, for example, it's the collective actions of a posse of cowboys or bandits or whatever. And you're more zoomed in and you're thinking more about how each one of those characters might react if they're all controlled by a single player. It's also quite possible to have each one controlled separately, like in a role-playing game. But it's sort of what is the level of detail and how specifically subdivided or specific are the distinctions between each character. Like in a World War II game, a guy with a rifle is basically the same as any other guy with a rifle. I mean, there might be a distinction. Maybe that's an elite unit. But that's about the biggest level of difference between anything. And it would probably be denoted in whatever formation they're in. So if you're playing a platoon game, that's probably the team or the squad. And that might be as much distinction as you'll have. And at that scale, which is referred to as battlefield scale, the character, if you're using individual models, they act more like hit points. Like they're more like point markers than they are like units. Though there are definitely things where if formation matters, like if you're playing a Roman Legion game, having rows of guys can have an actual specific tactical effect. But otherwise, the first thing they're doing is representing points that add up to that one thing.
Yeah, you're dealing with the aggregate value of a group of soldiers. So you're mostly looking at what is the outcome of their shooting as a combined whole. You still might be rolling dice for individuals, but you're going to be fast rolling a fistful of dice for the squad. So you still might roll all your rifles, then you'll roll your LMG, your light machine gun, and maybe a squad submachine gun on the leader, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that would be done to see what the effect of the squad is, and then you'd be taking losses, not necessarily one man at a time, but from the target teams or enemy squads, like you say, almost like they're ablative wounds or hit points.
Again, if you're dealing with areas where there's like firing lines, that can add another element. So obviously a handful of 15 mils take up more space than a single 28. But in many cases, if you can see one guy in that team, then you can usually hit the whole team, again, with a game that uses firearms. Another way to think about command level and scope, if you want to go the extreme opposite way, where we're not dealing with these sort of probable clouds of units, is to go into role-playing games where now we're dealing with one character, but they have a breakdown of individual attributes. So this is like in Dungeons and Dragons, this would be your ability scores like strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. You wouldn't want to track that many things if you had 10 units to track at once on a table.
That's right.
You could, but there's a certain amount of mental computing power that people are willing to put in. That, or you're sacrificing time on the game. And I think this is one of my main criticisms when I played 4th edition, which I jokingly scold as being overly complex skirmish game. And because it's using that Dungeons and Dragons framework of stats and abilities, but it does have some more streamlined abilities, it feels slow because there's so many things I have to kind of think about and modifiers that I could add, as opposed to just saying, that's a fighter, that's a fighter, that's a fighter, and that's a fighter. And now we're going to move them as a single unit or a formation of units, and then are going to intersect with the goblin, and there's going to be some fighting and some units will be lost. But no, each of those is an individual. And also, every player at the table is playing an individual. So now you end up with the same problem that you have when going through initiative order, playing a role-playing game is, well, I hope you know what you're doing now, because if you're figuring it out when your turn comes up, we could be waiting a while.
Right.
And there's always a bit of that. So as an example, how at least one aspect I found about 4th edition D&D that I found frustrating was that it was more like that war game, but it had a lot of that role-playing game baggage. And so that kind of ground it to a halt. But command level can be represented as the level of detail within a single unit, if that's the scope that you're working at. So I guess that brings us down to a conversation about abstraction. These two elements are kind of the dials of what you're working into. But then there's an abstraction level about, well, what does one action represent and what comes from that one action, or in some cases, resources. And when I say resources, I don't necessarily mean like money or material or ammunition or anything like that, but it could be things like a meta currency, like hit points. Like, what is hit points? That's a age-old debate.
Yeah, as I've heard it described, how much of hit points is sweat and how much of hit points is blood. And that's an interesting question or debate about, I guess, really what it's meant to represent. Like, when does the sword actually strike your character? Is that when you are below half HP? Is that the first time you're struck? Or is that not until you're getting close to some type of HP modifier or penalty getting below a certain value?
This is sort of the secret third topic that we're talking about, but I imagine talking about abstraction in games is something that's going to come up a lot. Whenever I've done any simulation design as part of my job, or when I was doing that, that was something that I had to explain to the person that I was building the simulation for, which was, we can't represent everything all the time unless like you put VR goggles on and then start like, is every detail actually important? Or do we need to focus down the detail on this particular interaction and then have the rest of it be accommodate to immersion? So the fact that I can freely walk around makes those parts of the simulation or game more interesting. But the thing that we're really focused on is, oh, I'm shooting at somebody or I'm having a conversation. And this part of the game must necessarily narrow in to make that a rewarding experience. Some designers, particularly of RPGs, try to do everything. And there's a few ways that can go. One example I should say that's guilty of this is 3rd and 3.5 edition D&D, where there's a logical rule for every single thing, and that makes sense. But then to actually run that in practice is a lot of sweat.
Yeah, I agree.
And now there's all these factors. It doesn't help that a lot of them are in a whole bunch of other books. So it's like, oh, I need book this and page that. And there's ways to get around that. You can photocopy and edit like a cheat sheet. But can you imagine that system if you didn't have a fundamentally underlying mechanic that was easy to understand? Or if the system being put in didn't adhere to that underlying mechanic?
Right.
Like in the sense of a D20 system, most things being based on a D20 roll plus or minus some value. So, like abstraction is like I'm basically just talking about abstraction as a problem to be solved in game design, but it is something that you always want to keep in the back of your mind if you're dealing with the mechanical elements of a game. And if you're a GM or you're in a war game, you're kind of half game designer all the time, or at least you have to have some consideration for like resolving an issue if it comes up and it's not in the book. So I think it's always good to know. I think that the problem to be solving is how abstract are we thinking, and how can I use that level of abstraction to solve certain problems in the game. And so the importance of me talking about abstraction is basically that scope and scale are outgrowths of that sort of broader problem, well, not problem, but like challenge of game design. Another aspect of this, which kind of ties into the scope, but was kind of a thing that when Troy and I were talking with kind of an interesting concept, was the power level of the game and like where that sets up in, I suppose that's a scope concept, and it more shows up in role-playing games.
Yeah, it's more of a role-playing consideration when you're thinking about almost like, what is a character, not only their level, but what is their base of power and what they're capable of.
Yeah, and the term, I guess the scale that Troy and I use is this idea between principled and cinematic.
Principled and cinematic can relate to the power levels of characters, but it in a lot of ways, it's how you actually want to approach the level of abstraction across the campaign as a whole as well. And an interesting distinction on that would be, I guess let's start with a heist. You're going to rob the vault. The more principled campaign approach would be something wherein you play out the beginnings of this heist through the planning phases with limited levels of abstraction. So in your scope, you're zoomed down. This can indicate lower power level characters, but it also does still work with your higher level characters. But what you're doing is you're actually going through and performing the steps that your characters would want to do prior to enacting the theft of the vault, right? So they would stake it out, bribe a guard, uh, weaken the defenses in various ways. Now, if you wanted to take a more cinematic approach, you could bypass all of that and you could begin at the heist. In some ways, this is beginning in medias res. In other ways, it's beginning at the interesting part to some. And the way that you would represent these setup moments that in a principled campaign that you would go through 1, 2, 3 and play them out, in this cinematic campaign, you would call back to them and you would reference them more abstractly at almost a higher level of scope through the lens of them having already happened and been performed in the past. Whether successfully or not will determine with the GM, but it's almost like you're not as concerned with the minutia and the logistics of executing this heist. It's more about the thrill and the drama of it that drives the cinematic action.
Yeah, and so if that specific example doesn't ring any bells, that is Blades in the Dark, and its flashback mechanic, effectively. Now, I think that that's a clever way to do that because what you're describing before that game and the way that that abstraction would be handled is it would be more hand-waved as opposed to having it be an opportunity of play, which is what Blades does, where not only are we saying that, oh, I bribed the guard, but I want you to play out that scene where you did that. Now we're having a role-playing opportunity that might even involve some kind of skill check, and it still means that you did the thing, but the outcome might vary. It might add some interesting details. Yeah, there's these different ways of approaching it. Now, wargaming, especially the older type of wargaming, definitely came from the more principled design. If you read a lot of Gary Gygax's books, you can tell that he's thinking from base principles, which we've mentioned when we did the AD&D episode, where it's not always the most manageable thing, but you're thinking, oh, if I walk through this jungle, how likely am I going to encounter something? But also like fatigue and what level of how common it would be for me to get a disease or, falling through a crevice in the ground. And you're taking it one step at a time. If you're doing it principled, you're almost taking it down to the minute to minute, hour to hour. Combat certainly works that way. Let's get into some specific examples about how different games engage uniquely with some of those scope and scale concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. What's a game that you want to jump in on and describe first?
An interesting one that I don't know too much about, but I've started reading, and I have some suspicion about how successfully it performed this, but Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition had a campaign setting called Birthright that took the old idea of domain play where, oh yeah, I'm a fighter and I've achieved level whatever where I become a lord or baron or however you express that in your game world. And now you have a domain of land that is under your purview. And it has interesting systems for retainers, effectively. Like, what would you call that? Like a regent? So if I step away from the throne to go on a quest, who do I leave in charge? And how does that affect anything that happens to my kingdom if I come back? And the reason that is relevant to the scope and scale of the game, I mean, that should be pretty obvious. You're playing somebody that has way wider influence over the world than some peasant that picked up a sword and has decided to go into a dungeon. The fact that that's how the game can start is interesting because they're kind of making a statement about where the fun is found in that setting. And that's not everybody's cup of tea. I think if you're going to run a game like that, you should let everybody know we're playing a role-playing game, but it's got domain-level play as the focus.
It has politics. It has warfare. It has minor, barely, kind of not really, but still economics.
Yeah. I also have some reservations around how well some role-playing games do this as opposed to war games, There's a thing that I don't have any specific proof, and I'd love to have somebody show me an example of this where it doesn't work like this. From my experience, a role-playing game that scales up is a lot more challenging to run than a war game that scales down. Did I say that right? I think I kind of expressed that.
Yeah, like a war game that can contain an RPG in it. So a war games campaign at, say, a battlefield level, command level, could incorporate underneath it an RPG campaign, which is running at a man-to-man scope.
Yeah. So I think there's a good example that you can break us down because I think you understand this game a bit more. But the game Dux Britannianum or Britannianum?
Yeah. So Dux Britannianum, that is a game set during the Roman, retreat from Britain when the Saxons began their migration across from northern Germany. So it's in like 500, 600 AD time period. And what you're looking at is the Britons living as if they were Romans, fighting off the Saxons who are moving into their traditional lands. So you have this really interesting setting. It's also contextualized as Arthurian, as the origin of that legend. So there's a lot going on there, but you specifically play a noble lord, either for the Saxons or the Britons, and you are managing their career development, as well as making kingdom scale decisions, such as purchasing upgrades like watchtowers, hill forts, upgrading the towns, and you're expanding your territory on a map. So there are definite, like, high command level decisions you're making, but then you're going to actually hop down into a miniatures battle game that plays in a dual skirmish or battle capacity using the same scale of models. So, for example, when you're playing that game, the Saxon player can elect to conduct raids, and these are done using the same collection of models that they would field in any game, but they have different objectives, where it's stealing livestock, capturing loot, raiding a farm. So some of these different concepts, but they kind of encourage more of a loose skirmish order play. Whereas once you get to a certain point in the campaign that you're going to challenge for territory as the Saxon player, or as the Romano-British try and take back territories, you fight a battle, again, same size of armies, but now it's more of a kill-em-all, and you're starting in a formalized battle line. So by changing the scenario conditions, the game has almost implied a different shift in the scale it's representing, but you're not needing to all of a sudden now have 60 more guys because it's a battle type scenario. So Dux Britannianum manages to play at about 4 different scales and meaningfully engage with each of them at different levels in its campaign. So the most level of detail is in the skirmish and the battle tabletop games, but you still do have a strategic level and a man-to-man personal level for your character as you manage them and their growth as the kingdom as well.
So I think, tying back to my point, with a game that uses, like, a war game that has very abstracted units, there's something a little bit more elegant, maybe, about adding more detail to a specific unit, or sort of tracking the implications of these military units as you scale up. So adding more detail to, say, your lord is scoping down, and viewing the implications of these raids is scaling up.
Yeah, exactly. And then you scale up even further when you get to a battle, for example.
I'm not sure we're measuring the scales exactly the same way I'm thinking of them, but, like, to me, down means closer to the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So a raid would be beneath a battle.
Yeah, exactly. So there's like a raid, and that's like a smaller aspect of some bigger conflict that's happening in a different area. Okay, so we are on the same page with that. And then again, scope works the same way. As we scope up, it becomes more abstracted so that the values representing each of those units become more singular. And as we scope down, which in a war game may only apply to certain characters,
right,
those characters have more details or more attributes attached to them.
Yeah, like nobles or officers or heroes, right?
to use the chain of command example, activations done by like officers. Actually, this is true of bolt action in some senses. There being a trait attached to leader units that can then activate other units on the table is a level of scope that's a bit more drilled down into for the purposes of giving commands.
Yeah, because the command is coming from someone. It's not abstract like you have a dice pool of command points that you can allocate. It's like literally this officer is the guy giving this command. So that's drilled down to a lower scope, but it's providing something really worthwhile and rewarding by showing you that interaction in a more literal way. And that's sometimes something you can lose with abstraction.
Yeah, for sure. And there are role-playing games that play around with this idea. I think the one that I have a distinctive memory, mostly running, is Fantasy Flight's Rogue Trader role-playing game.
That's right.
And so it does a lot of interesting things, like it abstracts, we'll call them commerce political actions, economic political actions, into things called endeavors, which are essentially like self-directed quests, where if the player characters achieve this objective, they now raise the stat of how much wealth they have. And then that stat can be used to then purchase a greater investment. It seems to be taking the credit rating system from Call of Cthulhu, which is another sort of abstraction, as opposed to counting money in coins, and using it as a way to sort of like take the idea of negotiating value and the value itself and combining them together. Endeavors also exist in Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing, 4th edition, particularly.
That's right. Yeah.
Maybe you can kind of give us how those work.
Well, that game, I really love the downtime activities you get between adventures. And this is again a shift in scale, in time scale this time, because we're used to in our, individually character-driven role-playing games, playing moment to moment, seeing what happens as we make our decisions as the day goes along. Now, when you hit these downtime activities, you're looking at the scope of a week to 2 weeks to longer in some cases, where your character will be carrying out a whole range of activities. They'll be going to the tavern, they'll be sleeping, they'll be making purchases, they'll be doing a number of things. But at the end, they will have produced the new enchanted dagger. And that process is abstracted away from you as the player, and you don't have to track that whole thing. But within the activity itself, it's accounted for, and then you get your ideal outcome.
So do you have any other interesting examples of how this element of game design is actually handled?
Well, a game that does it really interesting is the campaigns of BattleTech, because that is like a Russian doll of cascading scales, where you'll have interstellar operations where you're conducting the invasion of a system. You'll jump in with your jump ship, you'll have your drop ships come out, you'll hit the planet, and there's rules for literally every step of the way. Not that you need all of them or that the rule system even encourages you to use all of them. It's more of a buffet that you pick what you want. But the scope and scale in this instance is really up to you as the player to pick a few different lenses that you're interested in. So if you wanted to do a regimental mech action across the scope of a nation, you could easily represent that in Strategic Battle Force, right? Using that rule set. You would fight that battle. But then you might notice the clash for this city in the mountains was really interesting. So let's zoom in and do an alpha strike of a company fighting their way up the main highway. That was so cool. The fight for the reactor on the left flank? Why don't we zoom in again and do classic BattleTech for a one-on-one duel for control of the reactor between two pilots? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it just gives you this dynamic way to go up and down the food chain of your event. A lot of people refer to that as telescopic play. And that type of telescopic campaign play is something I am personally really motivated by in my gaming. And I'm always looking for pairing a skirmish game to a battlefield game, or being able to run different scopes with the same models, or even different scales of models, like Horus Heresy using epic scale models and then 28 mil models, right? But it's always trying to find this zooming in and this zooming out, this macro to micro approach.
Some games even have a kind of implied sort of use of that telescopic gaming. For instance, Warlord games often have a naval game, and then they'll have like a ground troop equivalent game. So I'm thinking like one example would be Black Seas.
Oh, okay.
But then they have a sort of muzzle-loaded rifle game. I've forgotten what it's called, that you could play as a sort of telescoping down. So, you have your naval battle, then you land your troops, and now you go into a campaign where they're like trying to capture the fort.
Yeah, exactly. Like you could do really cool things. Like if you wanted to do a naval battle game and then go into, say, like a campaign of black powder games where you're moving around big blocks of troops, but they're representative of battalions and companies and squadrons of your musketeers, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So that's totally something that's accounted for in the way that a lot of games are designed these days, because there's that natural desire to see the whole event. Because when you play, say you're going to play a game like Rommel, that's a World War II divisional level game that's quite abstract. It's even a miniatures game on a square grid. It's so abstract. So you might fight out a World War II battle with this to see what happens, but it doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't tell you about the squad leader helping his machine gun team reload on the corner to hold off the next enemy squad. It will not tell you that story. It'll tell you a story of logistics and of maneuver, but there's stuff it doesn't say, and having that telescopic gaming allows you to get that story and that POV as well.
Yeah. Oh, and the game I was thinking of is called Black Powder.
That's the one. Okay, cool. Glad we found it.
Yeah, so Black Seas and Black Powder being kind of sister games that play together if you wanted to have that multi-level battlefield. But to talk back to the BattleTech aspect, that was partly the role of Aerotech, which they have not re-released, but is a game that exists where it's basically the conflicts that happen between planets on starships. And also some of the interaction between the ships and the planet's surface as well.
Yeah, I would love to see that resurrected somehow.
And that would be fun. I don't know if they're encouraged, like if Catalyst is leaning into re-releasing that, but that if they wanted to add another level to the game, you could certainly do that.
But, check this out, too. This is another interesting element of scope and scale I want to talk about. Starfleet battles. So that is ostensibly a Star Trek game. It's a man-to-man game in that you are playing the members of the crew of a starship, whether you're individually the science officer or the weapons officer or whatever, or you have a couple guys, but you're sort of controlling them as the limbs, or how did you say it, the organs of a greater whole. And that's an interesting way to have your scope zoomed in practically as much as it possibly could, where you're not only looking at what a specific character or game element is capable of, you're looking at its arm, or its engines, or just its sensors. Like you're zoomed in so specifically. Adeptus Titanicus, the mech game by GW, feels like this too. But it's really interesting to me that you can zoom in so much that the base element isn't even a whole. You're actually dealing with the different components of that element.
Well, and if you want to flip that around and slightly tie it back to some aspects of the Rogue Trader role-playing game, but I think a better example of this is any of the Star Trek RPGs. Well, they all sort of handle this problem a little differently, but the idea is group actions on a starship. Like how do you make that fun? And there's different answers to that. But that can be abstracted down to if you're playing a Dungeons & Dragons game in a nautical setting where you're all members of a pirate crew or something like that. And so different characters' roles on the ship, like, oh, I'm going to make sure that the guns are loaded and I'm commanding the guys firing them. But then somebody is also handling the sails as they're being dropped. And there's somebody steering.
Yep.
And there's somebody giving general orders. And maybe there's a morale sort of function to that. But then that can scale all the way up to like a crazy example. One game I really want to try just because of the it's a role-playing game that really tries to wrap in a very large scope, is Modiphius's Dune RPG.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I've only sort of just been able to kind of leaf through it, but it gives a suggestion of playing a game where you're in control of like an entire house of, the Imperium in the Dune universe, which is huge. It could occupy multiple planets. It's interesting because I feel that it kind of ties into a game that they published, which I believe is by UFO Publishing, or I can't remember the company, the actual design of it, but it's a smaller game, really good production values, called Legacy: Life Among the Ruins. And it's a similar idea, though it's using the powered by the Apocalypse engine, so it's using a very simplified rule system, where Dune, I think, uses that the same rule system that Conan and those other games use, 2D20, which is, I haven't tried it yet. I actually really need, we really need to try a 2D20 game, because there's a lot of them out there, and I'm like, I've heard it gets pulpy action really good.
I would love to do a Conan, man. I go way back on Conan, so that would be really fun to do some 2D20.
Oh, same. We're big Howard heads over here, so
yeah, always. So that would be really cool. Another game that I really want to play in a amendment to a 5th edition campaign would be Stronghold and Followers by MCDM. They have a really interesting take on both mass combat and domain play in this tome, and it adds on to a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So there's a lot of character tooling and attribute management that goes into making a modern D&D character, right? It's a bit build heavy. However, this almost embraces that and takes a step further by taking that build management and having you make an army, having you make a fortress. So it's playing on that same type of fun, but it's just giving you new things to build and manage now. So I think it's quite a cool game. I've yet to get it to table, but I have a 5th edition campaign with the new 5.5 update looming in my future. So I'm certain I can, get ideas from this taken forward.
Yeah. From what I can tell on the breakdown of that one, it is a smoother, more manageable interpretation than, say, previous attempts in Dungeons & Dragons to bring mass combat and other domain play, as I had mentioned earlier with Birthright. So, though I haven't, I'm still interested in figuring those out. Yeah. So I think that kind of brings us to the end of our point in talking about this. So what did we go through? So we talked about how the different levels of scope and scale as different points of abstraction really do decide on what the focus of any game actually is. And the broader, more telescoping of those features are, the more complexity you deal with, but also the more detail and perhaps creating a richer world.
That's absolutely right.
So I think we'll call it there. Next week's episode, we're going to do one that we've referred to multiple times and is like one of my favorite easy to jump into role-playing games, which is Goodman Games Dungeon Crawl Classics. Finally.
A real classic, to be sure.
And a different interpretation or a different branch from the 3.5 system, but going into a totally different dimension of gonzo weirdness. So until then, we will continue to make more episodes like this to add to our roster of existing content. And we hope that you enjoy it and let us know. All right. Take care.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.